Let's try again. Good morning, everyone. How's it going? Yeah? All right, so my name's James Lamont. I teach academic skills and English language for postgraduate students in the education department at the University of York. So mainly in-sessional work, but I've got some experience of doing pre-sessional as well. The title of today's talk and open session is Contemplating Criticality, which is perfect for 9 o'clock in the morning on the third day. I hope you all got some coffee this morning. So, yeah, key questions I want us to think about today. What are we talking about when we talk about critical thinking? What skills and dispositions are required for critical thinking? And are current ideas of criticality problematic and potentially biased against some students? So we've got about 50 minutes to do all this. Do you think we've got time to manage that? Yeah. Cool. All right, let's go. So, the structure of this will be, first of all, I'll put you in small groups to have a quick group discussion, get some basic ideas about criticality and your experiences of working with criticality. Then I'll take a quick look at some of the literature I did and a small-scale study to find out what people think about criticality. And then there'll be a big discussion about some of the problems we've talked about and potential solutions to that. And I made a Padlet so we can put some of the ideas up on the board and talk about those together. All right, so yeah, quick introduction, critical thinking in the master's course. So critical thinking is absolutely a key skill for master's students if you look at the QAA and things like that, and most of the rubrics will have critical thinking on them. So it's something which absolutely our students need to focus on in their master's degree, and it's often included in EAP curriculum for that reason. So a lot of East Asian students, which I've experienced with, have self-reported this as a weakness. They've said that, I often really struggle with critical thinking, and there's some evidence to back that up. And often lecturers will say these students have difficulties with criticality. So it's definitely something which we need to focus on and practice in our classes. It's possible two possible explanations for this could be cultural reasons, which we'll talk about in a bit, or due to the difficulty of expressing criticality in a second language. And there's plenty of research to explore both of these options. So, one of the difficulties of talking about critical thinking is that it's quite hard to define. I think we all know what we're talking about with critical thinking, but it's quite hard to express that into words in a way that someone can clearly understand. So Johnson and Hamby did a meta-analysis of all of the attempts to define critical thinking, and they came up with a conclusion that we don't really know. We all have some vague ideas about it, but there are no clear, specific definitions which we could use. And I mean, that's potentially a good reason for that. When in an academic essay we're asking students to show critical thinking, we're kind of asking them to go beyond what we've taught them, to use their own imagination and their own intelligence as well. So if we told them this is what you have to do in order to do critical thinking, and we broke it down into a series of simple steps, that might undermine that. One of the best attempts at defining it, one of the most commonly used ones, is Ennis. And he argues that critical thinking is reasonable and reflective thinking focused on deciding what to believe or do. Do you think this is a helpful definition for students? If I got a student and their essay feedback says you need to be more critical here, if I tell them you should be more reasonable and more reflective in this, I don't think they'll really take much away from that. So we have to break it down. I mean, if we talk about the plenary session yesterday, they talked about signifiers and signified. I fear that we're replacing the word critical thinking with reasonable reflective thinking isn't actually making it clearer. We're replacing one signifier with another. But, one of the questions I've been thinking about for a while since I've started taking an interest in critical thinking is, do we need a clear definition of it? I think perhaps descriptions of critical thinking and examples of critical thinking might be enough. So when we talk about critical thinking with international students, I work mostly with international students, largely from China, and They really value the critical thinking sessions that we do and the time we spend in class working on critical thinking, because they often get feedback from their formative assignments saying they need to be more critical about things and they struggle to understand what they're really being asked to do here. So this is a noted issue. Two possible explanations for this are cultural factors leading to different reasoning approaches in academic writing and different expressions of ideas, different expressions of logic and things like that. The second idea is that critical thinking is hindered by having to think in a second language. Thinking in a second language uses up a lot of brain power, which makes it harder to think critically about a topic. And there's plenty of research done by that. You can see that most of the good research on the first one, I think, tends to be a bit older, and this tends to be a much more popular idea today, the second one. But we'll take a quick look at both of them. Everyone okay so far? Cool. All right. First one, critical thinking as a social practice. Has anyone here read Atkinson, 1997? Yeah? I know you have, but yeah. So Atkinson's paper, I'd say it's quite an old one, first of all. So if a student submitted a paper from 1997, I would be a bit skeptical. But this is probably the best description of critical thinking as a cultural practice, I think. So, and it's also a really well-written paper, so I'd strongly recommend taking a look at this one. He argues that critical thinking, as expected in the Western Master's essay, is more a reflection of certain academic traditions than it is a reflection of like the pure mind of the students. He calls this a social practice. There's a nice quote from Atkinson here. He says, "By social practice, I mean the kind of behaviour in which an individual is automatically immersed by virtue of being raised in a particular cultural milieu." Is that how you pronounce that word? Yeah. Cool. And which the individual therefore learns. A good example of this is common sense. So when we talk about common sense, it's hard to define what really counts as common sense and what doesn't count as common sense. We just know. And he argues that critical thinking is another example of that. He also argues that because we struggle to define critical thinking, because we struggle to define it, we kind of don't really know what the parameters of critical thinking are. We can think critically, but we don't necessarily have the language to explain what we're doing, to explain to people what we're doing. So this is why it's hard to tell people what counts as critical thinking and what doesn't. His conclusion is critical thinking is cultural thinking. This is a reflection of certain values and practices socialized through the traditional elite education which people experienced in North America and Western Europe. So it's a reflection of the sort of processes people went through in public schools and top universities in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Lots of essay writing and debates and discussion. So it's much more of a cultural practice than the sort of pure intellectual engagement which some people think it is. Second option, critical thinking is hindered by thinking in a second language. So Rie, really interesting lecturer in Japan, he did a very interesting experiment. He taught a debate class in Japan and he split it up into two different groups. One group were taught debate in their native Japanese and one group were taught debate in English. So the assessment for one group was in Japanese and the other assessment was in English. These debates were evaluated by 3 Australian debate judges. So the Japanese debate was translated into English for them. It was found that the Japanese debate was much stronger in terms of traditional markers of criticality. They used better sources, they used more sources, the arguments were better, their rebuttals to each other were stronger than in English. So his conclusion is that the English speakers' minds were so preoccupied with finding the appropriate words to say that there was little mental space available for a proper consideration of argument and counter-arguments. And I think that's a really compelling idea, that criticality just requires some free mental space. They must have been so stressed trying to think about what the right thing to say was that it really impeded the quality of their arguments. And this, of course, has a lot to say about our students in our classes trying desperately to speak up when they're really struggling to think in a second language as well. Alright, so I'm going to talk for a little bit about a study I did, and then we'll have a big discussion together. So, skills and dispositions for critical thinking. It's the third topic we have to think about. So going back to Ennis, who I mentioned earlier, his paper is a strange one because it's basically a list of 18 skills and 12 dispositions one needs for critical thinking. So I thought I'd try and replicate this study, find out what my students and colleagues think about critical thinking, think about what are the key skills and dispositions required for it. So 24 students and 6 tutors responded. Here's examples of the skills they suggested which are really important for critical thinking. Where it says S, that's from students. Where it says T, it's from teachers. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to take a look at these yourself. So I think most of these aren't particularly interesting or unusual. You know, objective analysis evaluation, yep, sounds good. This one about background knowledge on many fields is important, because I mean certainly I'd like to find out more about what their students saying and why that's important for critical thinking. Pros and cons, yep. I like how someone talks about the ability to access Windows-based IT systems, because that really does require a level of critical thinking that's beyond me, so like... And the last one, understanding of what critical thinking is, especially its difference to criticism, definitely. So important our students understand, but we're not just taking texts apart. Instead, we're using them to construct arguments. But the dispositions, I think, are much more interesting. So, give you a minute or so to look at the dispositions. Yeah, I think this idea about the dispositions needed for critical thinking is a really interesting one. And I love that the student said being suspicious. Because, like, you know, I think they're really onto something there. You do have to be kind of, maybe the same skills required for being suspicious are required for being critical, but maybe they're not quite the same thing. And I love that someone said brave, because that's the main thing about criticality. It requires you to step out of your comfort zone, step out of what you've been taught, and just go for it. But also, this is way cool, this one here. Someone showing real critical thinking about this question. So my conclusions from doing this quick survey. It's interesting data, and it's nice to talk about. But I'm not sure if it's really useful for the grand product of helping our students understand critical thinking. I think perhaps the premise of the question is wrong, talking about skills and dispositions required. I'm not sure if it really helps our students demonstrate critical thinking in their work. I think there's a real risk of one word, like critical, being replaced by another word, like analysis, without really understanding what these words mean. So just playing like, just juggling words around, without really exploring their meaning or use. So I've always found, since then, much more value in exploring criticality through its presence or absence in writing, rather than teaching students what it is, making students look for it themselves and try and identify what we're thinking about. So yeah, exemplars are great for that. I always got access to some previous year's exams, get students to find sections of it, what do they think, are sections that show critical thinking, or I select sections and get students to think about why have I selected this. Nothing too radical here. But with the launch of ChatGPT, I think this is a godsend for teaching critical thinking, because ChatGPT can't quite do it yet. It can produce a great essay which understands a topic, which explores a topic, but then just get students to look at an essay written by ChatGPT and think about how could they improve it? How could we make it more human? Get students to improve it by developing arguments or expanding on key points there. Above all, it's about showing students that they're already doing critical thinking. Not that something we need to teach them how to do, but they're already doing it. We just need to make them aware of when they're doing it and how they can show it. I think that's one of the big issues we have to think about as EAP teachers. Is our job to teach students how to think critically or how to show that they're thinking critically. So, I've kind of talked at you guys for quite a long time now, so let's have some discussions in your groups.